The fog rolled in from the North Atlantic like a living thing, dense and cold, wrapping itself around the fishing docks of Portland, Maine with fingers that turned everything gray and indistinct. Helen Margaret O'Brien stood at the window of her bakery on Commercial Street, watching the harbor disappear into mist, and thought about all the things that could hide in that fog. German U-boats, for instance, wolf packs that prowled the shipping lanes just beyond the horizon, sending American merchant vessels to the bottom of the ocean with a regularity that made the newspapers print casualty lists like sports scores. It was April 1942, and the war that seemed so distant just months ago now felt close enough to touch, close enough to taste in the salt air that mixed with the smell of rising dough. Helen was 29 years old, the daughter of a lobsterman and a seamstress, and she'd spent her entire life in this harbor town where everyone knew everyone and secrets were supposed to be impossible to keep. But she was keeping one now, a secret that sat in her chest like a stone, heavy and dangerous and absolutely necessary. Before we go deeper into Helen's world, into the choices she made and the price she paid for them, I need to acknowledge something. I know that our audience is made of intelligent and discerning people like you, individuals who understand that the most important stories are often the ones that never made the history books. The quiet acts of courage performed by ordinary people in extraordinary times. If you value content that brings these hidden heroes into the light with the depth and respect they deserve, please subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue uncovering these remarkable true stories. Now, let me take you into Helen's life during those dark days when the Atlantic burned with torpedoed ships, and the difference between survival and destruction often came down to information that traveled hidden inside a loaf of bread. Helen had never intended to become a spy. That word itself seemed ridiculous, something from adventure novels and radio serials, not something that applied to a baker who spent her days elbow-deep in flour and her nights listening to the foghorns that warned ships away from the rocky Maine coast. But war had a way of transforming people, of revealing capacities they never knew they possessed. Helen's bakery, O'Brien's Daily Bread, had been her father's before it was hers, a modest storefront operation that had served the waterfront community for 30 years. When Sean O'Brien's heart gave out in the winter of 1940, Helen had inherited not just a business, but a way of life, a rhythm of 4 a.m. wake-ups and the meditative repetition of kneading, shaping, baking. She inherited the regular customers who came in for their morning rolls, the fishermen who bought day-old bread for bait, the longshoremen who lined up for meat pies at lunch. She inherited a place in the community, a role that was both visible and invisible, essential but easily overlooked. And when the war came, when German submarines began hunting American ships with devastating efficiency, Helen inherited something else, an opportunity to make a difference that no one would ever see coming. The U-boat threat along the American East Coast in early 1942 was catastrophic in a way the government tried desperately to hide. German submarines operated with near impunity, sinking tankers within sight of shore, turning the ocean into a graveyard of twisted metal and burning oil. The military called it Operation Drumbeat, and it was devastatingly effective. Merchant sailors began calling the stretch of water from Cape Hatteras to the Gulf of Maine Torpedo Junction, a name spoken with a kind of gallows humor that came from knowing your odds of survival were worse than the soldiers on the front lines. Portland Harbor, with its active shipping traffic and proximity to the major convoy routes, existed in a state of constant nervous tension. Everyone knew someone who'd been lost at sea. Everyone lived with the knowledge that the next torpedo could be aimed at a ship their brother crewed, their cousin captained, their father worked on. The fear was thick enough to taste, mixing with the salt air and the smell of fish and diesel fuel that defined the waterfront. Helen's involvement began with a man named Lieutenant Thomas Mackenzie, a naval intelligence officer who walked into her bakery on a March morning when the ice was just beginning to break up in the harbor. He was young, maybe 25, with the kind of earnest face that hadn't yet learned to hide its urgency. He ordered coffee and a Danish, sat at the small table near the window, and watched the harbor for 20 minutes without eating. When the morning rush had cleared and Helen was wiping down the counter, he approached her with an awkwardness that suggested he'd been rehearsing what to say. "Miss O'Brien," he said, using her unmarried title with the precision of someone who'd done his research, "I need to talk to you about a matter of national security." Helen had laughed, thinking it was a joke, some kind of strange pickup line. But Mackenzie's face remained serious, and he produced credentials that identified him as attached to the Naval Intelligence Office, and suddenly the conversation stopped being funny. What Mackenzie explained, in a quiet voice that barely carried beyond their corner of the bakery, was that the Navy was desperate for information about U-boat movements. They had submarines patrolling, they had aircraft searching, they had destroyers hunting, but the ocean was vast and the German wolf packs were clever. What they needed was eyes on the water, people who could observe patterns, notice things, report what they saw. And they needed a way to pass that information quickly and secretly to intelligence officers who could act on it. "We've been watching you," Mackenzie said, and Helen's stomach had dropped. "You make deliveries all over the waterfront, to the Coast Guard station, to the Navy Yard, to the Merchant Marine offices, to the Fishing Fleet offices. You're everywhere, and nobody thinks twice about seeing you. You're just a baker." The way he said it wasn't dismissive but strategic, as if being underestimated was the greatest asset a person could have. Helen's first instinct was to refuse. She wasn't trained for espionage, wasn't qualified, wasn't brave enough. But Mackenzie had come prepared with more than just a request. He brought photographs of merchant ships burning, of lifeboats overcrowded with survivors, of oil-slicked water that had been funeral pyres for American sailors. He brought statistics that weren't in the newspapers: how many ships sunk, how many men lost, how the supply lines to Britain were being strangled. "The Germans are winning the Atlantic," he'd said flatly. "If we can't stop them, if we can't protect our convoys, we'll lose this war before it really begins." Every piece of information helps. Every observation could save lives. He'd looked at her with those two young eyes and added, "You're in a position to help in a way most people can't, and I'm asking you to consider it." Helen had sent him away that day, told him she needed to think. But that night, lying in her small apartment above the bakery, listening to the foghorns and thinking about her cousin Jimmy, who crewed on an oil tanker, she'd made her decision. The training was minimal because there wasn't time for anything elaborate. Mackenzie came back 3 nights in a row after the bakery closed and taught Helen the basics of observation and reporting: how to estimate the speed and heading of ships, how to recognize different types of vessels, how to note weather conditions that might affect visibility or submarine operations, how to remember details accurately, how to encode simple information using a system based on bakery orders. Different types of bread represented different types of intelligence. Quantities indicated urgency. Delivery times signaled when and where something had been observed. It was crude but effective, designed to be memorized rather than written down, to exist only in Helen's mind where it couldn't be discovered. "You'll pass information to me through your deliveries," Mackenzie explained. "I've arranged for regular orders from my office. When you have something to report, you'll encode it in the order confirmation and bring it with the bread. If you see something urgent, you'll mark it with a red thread tied around the bag. Simple, deniable, safe. Except it wasn't safe. Not really." Mackenzie was honest enough to admit that if the Germans discovered what Helen was doing, if there were spies or sympathizers who figured it out, she'd be in danger that the Navy couldn't fully protect her from. "We're asking you to take a risk," he'd said. "I won't pretend otherwise. But the risk you're taking could help save hundreds of lives, maybe thousands." Helen had thought about her father, who'd survived the North Atlantic for 40 years, and always said the ocean demanded respect but repaid courage. She thought about the Constitution, the American value of standing up when it mattered. She thought about all the young men dying in the dark water, while U-boats slipped away unseen. "I'll do it," she'd said. And with those 3 words, she'd stepped across a line from ordinary life into something far more dangerous and far more important. The work began slowly, almost anticlimactically. Helen made her regular deliveries: fresh rolls to the Coast Guard station at dawn, pastries to the Navy Yard offices mid-morning, bread to the Merchant Marine office at lunch. But now she watched. She observed the ships in harbor, noted when they arrived and departed, tracked patterns in the schedules. She listened to conversations in the bakery, the casual talk of fishermen and sailors that contained nuggets of information about where they'd seen debris fields, where they'd noticed unusual activity, where the water looked wrong in ways that suggested a submarine's periscope. She walked the waterfront with eyes that no longer just admired the view, but cataloged details. Weather conditions, visibility, the behavior of the patrol boats that search for U-boats. And she encoded this information in her delivery slips, passing it to Mackenzie with the same casual efficiency she used for every other customer. The breakthrough came in May, during a week when the fog was particularly heavy and the tension on the waterfront was palpable. 3 merchant ships had been sunk in 4 days, all within 100 miles of Portland, and the pattern suggested a U-boat was operating close to shore, possibly even inside the harbor approach. Helen heard about it from Tommy Russo, a fisherman who came in for his morning coffee and mentioned, almost casually, that he'd seen something strange 2 mornings earlier while checking his traps. Out past Halfway Rock, he'd said, I saw what looked like a whale surfacing, but it was too regular, too mechanical. And then it was gone, like it had never been there. He'd shrugged it off, convinced himself he'd imagined it, but Helen's new training made her see it differently. A submarine surfacing to recharge batteries, a pattern that indicated where a U-boat might be operating. She'd marked that delivery to Mackenzie with a red thread. The information had been specific: location, time, conditions, the fisherman's observation. Mackenzie had taken it seriously, passed up the chain, and within hours, a patrol aircraft had been dispatched to search the area. They'd found nothing that day, but they'd established a pattern of coverage, watching that section of water with increased attention. 3 days later, a Navy blimp on patrol spotted a submarine shadow moving beneath the surface in almost the exact location Tommy Russo had described. They dropped depth charges, forced the submarine to surface, and a destroyer had engaged it in a running battle that ended with the U-boat scuttled and its crew captured. U-505, the intelligence officers would later determine, responsible for sinking at least 5 American merchant ships. Destroyed because a fisherman had noticed something unusual, and a baker had recognized its significance. Mackenzie had come to the bakery that evening after closing, his face flushed with an excitement he was trying to contain. You did it, he'd said. Your information led directly to that kill. Do you understand what this means? You've just saved lives. Potentially hundreds of lives on ships that won't be torpedoed because that U-boat is gone. Hella had felt something complicated and overwhelming. Pride mixed with horror, satisfaction mixed with sadness. The U-boat crew had been young men too, German sailors following orders, and now they were prisoners or dead. War demanded these impossible calculations, these choices where victory meant someone else's loss. But she thought about the American merchant sailors who would come home to their families, about the supplies that would reach Britain, about the larger purpose being served. What now? She'd asked Mackenzie. Now, he'd said, we keep going, because there are more U-boats out there, and we need every advantage we can get. The success brought increased responsibility. Mackenzie's office began requesting more detailed information, asking Helen to observe not just what she saw, but to actively seek out intelligence. Could she cultivate relationships with more fishermen, more dock workers, more people who might see or hear relevant things? Could she expand her delivery routes to cover more of the waterfront? Could she pay attention to patterns in how the U-boats seemed to operate, times of day they were spotted, weather conditions that seemed to correlate with attacks? Helen found herself living a double life, the surface existence of a baker going about her daily routine, and the hidden reality of an intelligence asset building a network of unwitting informants. She learned to ask questions that seemed like casual conversation, but were actually intelligence gathering. She learned to remember details with photographic precision. She learned to function on minimal sleep, baking through the nights and observing during the days, living on coffee and adrenaline and a sense of purpose that made the exhaustion bearable. The summer of 1942 brought a shift in the U-boat campaign. The easy pickings along the coast had diminished as American defenses improved, and the German submarines began operating in wolf packs further offshore, targeting convoys rather than individual ships. This made Helen's work more difficult, but also more crucial. The intelligence services needed to know where the wolf packs were congregating, how they were coordinating their attacks, what patterns they followed. And this information could sometimes be gleaned from careful observation of search and rescue operations, from debris patterns, from the timing and locations of distress calls that the Coast Guard responded to. Helen found herself decoding these patterns, looking for the intelligence hidden in what seemed like random tragedy. She started keeping a detailed mental map of the ocean beyond Portland Harbor, tracking where attacks occurred, looking for patterns that might predict where U-boats would strike next. In July, Helen's observations led to a second U-boat kill. She'd noticed a pattern in distress signals. 3 ships torpedoed over 10 days, all between midnight and 2 a.m., all along the same general shipping lane, about 60 miles southeast of Portland. The attack showed a level of knowledge about convoy schedules that suggested the U-boat was either extremely lucky or had access to intelligence about routes and timing. Helen had encoded this pattern in her reports to Mackenzie, suggesting that concentrated patrols during those hours in that area might catch the submarine. The Navy had been skeptical. It was a lot of ocean to cover based on what seemed like circumstantial evidence, but they dispatched a destroyer to the area as part of a larger patrol pattern. On the 4th night, the destroyer's sonar had picked up a contact, engaged, and after a 3-hour hunt, forced U-754 to surface. The submarine had been damaged in the depth charge attack and unable to dive. The crew had abandoned ship and been rescued, but the U-boat had been sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. Another wolf removed from the pack. Another unknown number of American lives saved. The second success brought attention Helen didn't want. Mackenzie's superiors began asking who this Baker was, how she was getting such accurate intelligence, whether she could be trusted. Mackenzie defended her fiercely, but Helen could feel the weight of scrutiny settling over her work. The Navy sent other officers to interview her, men with harder eyes and more aggressive questions. They wanted to know her background, her family, her politics, her friends. They wanted assurance that she wasn't a German sympathizer, wasn't a double agent, wasn't somehow compromised. The interrogations, because that's what they were, happened in the Stark office at the Navy Yard, and they left Helen feeling violated and angry. She was risking her life to help, and they were treating her like a suspect. But she understood it too. The stakes were too high to take anyone on faith alone. So she answered their questions, provided references, allowed them to investigate her life. And eventually, they decided she was genuine, valuable, worth protecting and cultivating. The protection came in subtle forms. Naval intelligence began monitoring her bakery, watching for anyone who might be watching her. They provided her with a direct contact number that could reach Mackenzie or his office at any hour. They gave her a cover story to explain any unusual behavior. She was doing volunteer work for the USO, organizing care packages for sailors, activities that required her to spend time on the waterfront and talk to military personnel. The cover was thin but plausible, and it gave Helen a shield of legitimacy. She used it carefully, never pushing too far, always maintaining the fiction that she was just a patriotic citizen doing her small part for the war effort, which, in a sense, was exactly what she was, just not in the way most people understood. By September, Helen's network of observational contacts had grown to include nearly 30 people, though none of them knew they were part of an intelligence operation. They were fishermen who mentioned strange sightings to the friendly Baker, who always remembered their names and asked about their families. They were Coast Guard enlisted men who talked about their patrols over coffee and pastries. They were dock workers who complained about schedule changes in convoy formations while buying their lunch. They were merchant marine officers who discussed routes and timing while waiting for their orders. Each conversation was innocent on its surface, but collectively they provided Helen with a comprehensive picture of naval activity in the Portland area. She became, in effect, a human intelligence clearinghouse, collecting disparate pieces of information and assembling them into actionable reports. Mackenzie called her the best asset we have in the sector, and while Helen found the praise uncomfortable, she couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing her work mattered. The 3rd U-boat kill came in October, and it was the most dramatic of all. Helen had been tracking reports of a submarine that seemed to be operating with unusual boldness, coming close to shore and attacking ships in daylight, rather than following the typical pattern of night attacks. The fishermen were spooked, reporting periscope sightings and near misses with torpedoes that had passed beneath their boats. The Coast Guard was on high alert, but the submarine seemed to vanish after each attack, disappearing into the deep water beyond the continental shelf. Helen had spent 2 weeks correlating all the reported sightings, all the attacks, all the near misses, looking for a pattern, and she'd found one. The submarine seemed to be using a specific underwater canyon as a hiding place, a deep trench where sonar had difficulty penetrating. It was bold, risky, closer to shore than most U-boats dare to operate, but explained how the submarine could tack and disappear so effectively. Helen had reported this theory with every detail she gathered: the canyon's location, the timing of the submarine's apparent entrances and exits, the correlation between tidal patterns and attack times. Mackenzie had been skeptical, as had his superiors. It seemed too convenient, too neat. But the attacks were continuing, and the fear along the waterfront was reaching a breaking point. Fishermen were refusing to go out. Merchant crews were near mutiny. Something had to be done. So the Navy had committed significant resources: 3 destroyers, 2 submarine chasers, and air coverage from patrol bombers. They'd set up a coordinated trap, positioning ships to block the canyon's exits while aircraft dropped sonar buoys to detect any movement. And then they'd waited. The U-boat had appeared exactly as Helen's pattern predicted, surfacing briefly at dusk to recharge batteries before what was presumably planned as a night attack. The patrol bomber had spotted it first, signaling the surface ships, and the trap had sprung shut. The submarine had tried to dive back into the canyon, but the destroyers were already in position, dropping depth charges in a coordinated pattern that covered every possible escape route. The battle had lasted hours, a deadly game of cat and mouse played in 3 dimensions. The U-boat had fought back, firing torpedoes that barely missed the destroyers, trying to break through the cordon. But eventually, the depth charges had found their mark. The submarine had been forced to surface, damaged and unable to dive, and faced with a choice between surrender and destruction, the crew had chosen to abandon ship. U-458. It turned out to be one of the most successful U-boats in the Atlantic campaign, responsible for sinking 11 Allied ships. Destroyed because a Baker had assembled a pattern from fragments of conversation and observation. The Navy wanted to recognize Helen, to give her a commendation, to publicize the success. But Helen had refused absolutely. Making her role public would end her effectiveness immediately. It would put her in danger. It would destroy the illusion of invisibility that made her work possible. More importantly, it would betray the trust of all the people who'd unknowingly provided her with information. They'd talked to her because she was a friendly baker who ran the neighborhood bread shop, not because they thought she was passing their casual observations to naval intelligence. Publicizing her role would feel like a betrayal of that trust. So the recognition stayed classified, filed away in reports that wouldn't be declassified for decades. And Helen went back to being just a baker, the woman who made excellent rye bread and always had a smile for her customers, unremarkable and unnoticed, and exactly where she needed to be. But the work took its toll in ways Helen hadn't anticipated. She started having nightmares about submarines, about drowning men, about the weight of responsibility for lives saved and lives lost. She developed insomnia, lie awake at night running through her observations, wondering if she'd missed something crucial, if her next report would be accurate enough, if she was doing enough. She lost weight, forgot to eat, survived on coffee and nervous energy. Her hands, which had always been steady and capable, developed a tremor that made intricate decorating work difficult. Her friends noticed a change, asked if she was all right, offered help she couldn't accept because accepting it would mean explaining what she couldn't explain. The isolation of living a double life was crushing in ways she hadn't expected. She couldn't talk about the most important thing in her life, couldn't share her fears or her triumphs, couldn't process the complicated emotions that came with knowing her work contributed to men dying, even if they were enemy combatants. She was alone with it all, carrying the weight in silence. Mackenzie saw it, recognized the signs of strain. He started coming by the bakery more regularly, not always for intelligence purposes, but sometimes just to check on her. He'd sit at the corner table and drink coffee and talk about inconsequential things, giving Helen a few minutes to just be a person having a conversation rather than an asset being managed. He told her about his family back in Ohio, about his fiancée who worked as a nurse and wrote him letters full of determination and hope. He told her about other intelligence operations, careful to avoid classified details, but sharing enough to let her know she wasn't alone in this strange shadow war. And sometimes, When the bakery was empty and the fog was thick outside, they'd talk about the moral weight of their work, the impossible calculations of war, the question of how you live with being part of the machinery that killed people, even when it was necessary, even when it saved other lives. There were no good answers, but there was comfort in knowing someone else understood the questions. Winter came early in 1942, bringing storms that shut down the harbor for days at a time and drove the U-boats to deeper waters where hunting was more difficult but safer. The attacks slowed but didn't stop. The wolf packs were still out there, still hungry, still taking a terrible toll on Allied shipping. But the balance had shifted slightly. Better defenses, improved tactics, and yes, better intelligence were making the Atlantic a more dangerous place for German submarines. Helen's contributions were a small part of that larger shift, a few pieces of a massive puzzle. But they mattered. The 3 U-boats she'd helped destroy, the intelligence she provided about patterns and tactics, the network of observation she built. It all added up to something significant. Mackenzie told her that analysts at headquarters referred to the Portland sector as the Baker's Watch, a grudging acknowledgement of her effectiveness. But success brought new dangers. There were indications that German intelligence had become aware that American defenses in the Portland area were unusually effective, that U-boat operations there were failing at higher rates than other sectors. They didn't know about Helen specifically. Her cover was still intact, but they were looking for explanations. There were rumors of counterintelligence operations, of German agents being inserted into American ports to identify security leaks. Mackenzie warned Helen to be more careful, to vary her routines, to watch for anyone showing unusual interest in her or her activities. The fear that had been theoretical became concrete. Helen found herself checking over her shoulder, scrutinizing customers more carefully, wondering if the friendly stranger who'd come in to buy bread was actually a spy evaluating her as a target. The paranoia was exhausting, but necessary. One mistake, one careless moment, could be fatal. In December, Helen's father's old friend, Captain Richard Murphy, came to the bakery with news that made her blood run cold. Murphy ran a merchant tanker on the Atlantic convoy routes, and he'd just returned from a voyage where his ship had been attacked by a U-boat. They'd survived, but barely, and during the interrogation of German prisoners taken from another sunken submarine, something disturbing had emerged. The prisoners had been asking questions about American intelligence gathering in ports, about how the Americans seemed to know U-boat positions with such accuracy. They were specifically asking about civilians who might have access to information about how intelligence might be passed. "They're hunting for spies," Murphy had said, his weathered face grave. "Our spies. American civilians who are helping the war effort. And Helen, I know you. I've known you since you were a kid. I see how you watch the harbor, how you talk to people, how you're always at the Navy Yard. I'm not asking you to confirm anything, but I'm telling you to be careful. More careful than you've ever been." Helen had thanked Murphy, maintained her cover, acted confused by his warning, but inside her mind was racing. If Murphy had noticed her pattern, others might have too. And if German intelligence was actively hunting for civilian informants, she was in danger that no amount of Navy protection could completely mitigate. She told Mackenzie about the conversation that evening, and saw real fear flash across his face for the first time. "We need to pull you back," he'd said immediately. "It's too risky. We can find other ways to gather intelligence." But Helen had refused. The work was too important, the network too valuable, the need too great. "I'll be more careful," she'd said. "I'll change my routines, be less obvious. But I'm not stopping. Not while I can still help." Mackenzie had argued, had tried to order her to stand down, but ultimately he couldn't force her. She was a civilian volunteer, not a soldier under his command. The most he could do was provide additional security and pray that she stayed lucky. Christmas 1942 was bleak. The war news was grim on every front. The Atlantic was still a killing ground. The bakery was struggling because ingredients were rationed and customers were pinched by wartime economics. Helen spent Christmas Eve alone in her apartment, listening to carols on the radio and thinking about all the families with empty chairs at their dinner tables, all the men who wouldn't come home. She thought about the 3 U-boats she'd helped destroy, about the German sailors who died or been captured, about their families who'd received telegrams saying their sons or husbands or fathers were gone. She thought about the American sailors who'd been saved, who'd made a home because those U-boats weren't hunting anymore. The math was impossible, the moral weight unbearable. She cried that night, alone in the dark, cried for all of it, the necessity and the horror and the loneliness of carrying this burden in silence. But the next morning, she woke up and went downstairs and made bread, because that's what you did in war. You got up and you did the work in front of you, and you kept going because stopping wasn't an option. The fishermen came in for their coffee. The dock workers bought their lunch. The sailors from the Navy Yard picked up their pastries. And Helen watched and listened and remembered, encoding information that would flow up through channels she never saw to decision-makers she'd never meet. Information that might save lives in ways she'd never know about. It was anonymous work, invisible work, unglamorous and dangerous and absolutely crucial. And she did it because someone had to, because she was positioned to help. Because when history asks if you'll step up, the only answer that lets you live with yourself is yes. The spring of 1943 brought a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic. New technologies, better tactics, increased resources, and yes, improved intelligence were finally shifting the balance against the U-boats. The killing grounds were becoming graveyards for submarines instead of merchant ships. The wolf packs were being hunted with the same ruthlessness they'd once employed. It was still dangerous, still costly, but for the first time since the war began, the Allies were winning. Helen's role in that victory was microscopic in the larger picture, but significant in her sector. The Portland approach had become one of the safest shipping lanes on the East Coast, a distinction that saved countless lives and helped keep supplies flowing to the war effort. And it had been accomplished largely through the patient, dangerous work of a baker who smuggled intelligence in bread deliveries. By mid-1943, the U-boat threat to the American coast had diminished significantly. The submarines had been pushed back into the mid-Atlantic, away from shore, forced to hunt in areas where they were more vulnerable to air attack and destroyer patrols. Helen's work shifted from active intelligence gathering to maintenance, keeping the observation network intact in case it was needed, but with less urgency. Mackenzie was transferred to another posting, replaced by a different officer who didn't have the same personal connection to Helen's work. The war was moving on, the focus shifting to invasion preparations to the Pacific, to the massive campaigns that would eventually bring victory. Helen found herself oddly bereft, missing the intensity and purpose that had defined her life for 18 months. Being just a baker again felt hollow after having been something more, after having mattered in a way that transcended the ordinary. The war ended in 1945, and Portland celebrated with the rest of the nation. Helen stood in the crowd in Monument Square as people cheered and cried and embraced strangers, feeling the relief and joy that came with knowing it was finally over. But she also felt separate, watching from a distance created by secrets she still couldn't share. The men came home, including her cousin Jimmy, who'd survived 4 years on his tanker, and its stories that would take the rest of his life to tell. The harbor came back to life, fishing boats and merchant ships operating without fear torpedoes. The bakery prospered again as rationing ended and ingredients became available. Life returned to something approaching normal. But Helen carried her war with her in ways that couldn't be celebrated or acknowledged. It wasn't until 1975 that Helen learned the full impact of her work. Mackenzie, retired and in his 60s, came to visit her in Portland. They sat in the bakery, 30 years older and infinitely wearier, and he told her what the classified files had finally revealed. The 3 U-boats she directly helped destroy had been responsible for sinking 29 Allied ships between them. 29 ships that would have continued sinking vessels if those submarines hadn't been stopped. Beyond that, her intelligence reports had contributed to tactical decisions that saved an estimated 40 additional ships from attack. Hundreds of sailors had come home to their families because Helen O'Brien had watched the harbor and listened to conversations and recognized patterns. You were one of the most effective civilian intelligence assets of the entire war, Mackenzie told her, and almost nobody knows it. I thought you should know. I thought you deserved to know that what you did mattered. It mattered enormously. Helen lived the rest of her life in Portland, running her bakery until she was too old to manage the early mornings and the physical labor. She never married, never had children, devoted herself to her work and her community. She watched the Cold War unfold, watched Vietnam tear the nation apart, watched the world change in ways she could never have imagined in 1942. She kept her secrets, as she'd been taught, because even after declassification, talking about her role felt like breaking faith with the people who'd unknowingly helped her, with the men who died in the U-boats she'd helped destroy, with the moral complexity of a war that had demanded impossible choices. She carried it all quietly, this hidden history, this shadow life that had run parallel to her public existence. Some wounds, she'd learned, were private. Some victories didn't need to be celebrated publicly to be real. If you stayed with me through Helen's entire journey, through every moment of courage and sacrifice and moral complexity, then you understand why these stories demand to be told. Helen O'Brien was just a baker, just an ordinary woman living an ordinary life, until history asked her to be more. And she answered that call with a courage that saved lives, that changed the course of a battle, that mattered in ways both vast and intimate. If this story touched you, if it made you think about the hidden heroes who walk among us, the ordinary people who do extraordinary things when the moment demands it, please take a second to like this video. It helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. And if you've been with me until the end, if Helen's story resonated with you, leave a comment saying Silent Courage remembered. It lets me know these histories are landing with people who truly value them. There are so many more stories waiting to be uncovered, so many forgotten heroes whose actions shaped our world. The next video explores another remarkable woman whose bravery changed the war in ways no one expected. Thank you for honoring these memories with your time and attention.